How exactly does a billion-dollar empire just vanish? Literally disappear in just 5 years? We usually look at massive corporate failures and think, it's just bad math, or maybe poor funding, or just plain old bad luck. But honestly, sometimes a business story is actually a profoundly human story. Today in this explainer, we're taking a look at one of the absolute greatest corporate collapses in modern history. And we're going to unpack it, not by staring at spreadsheets, but through the fascinating lens of human behavior.
Okay, let's dive into this. A lot of analysts look at the collapse of this particular tech giant and point out that they weren't just disrupted by some shiny new invention. Actually, it's more like they were assassinated by their own success. We're going to see exactly how unprecedented market dominance laid this incredibly deep psychological trap for the leadership team. It basically completely blinded them to reality. To really wrap our heads around the scale of this trap, we kind of need to jump back to the year 2007. Just to put this into perspective, at that time, 4 out of every 10 mobile phones on planet Earth were Nokias. 4 out of 10. They didn't just lead the market, right? They essentially were the market. And it is exactly this level of absolute, unquestioned dominance that sets the stage for the psychological breakdown we're about to look at. Section 1. The illusion of invincibility. How dominance breeds comfort.
Now, Nokia didn't just magically appear out of nowhere. Building this massive global scale took time, and their origins are, well, highly unexpected. Way back in 1865, they were literally just a simple paper mill in Finland. Fast forward to the 1960s, and they're this messy, completely unfocused conglomerate selling rubber boots and power cables of all things. But then, in the early 90s, they made this radical bet. They sold off the rubber and the paper to focus on exactly one thing: mobile phones. They aggressively championed the global GSM standard, and boom, by 1998, they were the best-selling phone brand in the entire world. So these guys clearly knew how to make big, successful pivots.
And that success, it peaked at a scale that's genuinely hard for us to fully comprehend today. Nokia wasn't just building phones anymore, they were building a global lifestyle. Just take the absolutely legendary Nokia 3310, for example. That single model sold a staggering 126 million units. No, seriously, 126 million. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer gravity of their dominance. Think about it. 126 million units is basically the equivalent of handing a Nokia 3310 to every single person living in Japan. And by 2008, they were selling 472 million handsets globally. That's way more than Apple and Samsung combined sell today. But here's the catch. This unprecedented success, it created a really dangerous feeling of invincibility. They were getting incredibly bulky and slow at the exact moment they desperately needed to be fast. Which brings us right to the inciting incident of 2007 that literally changed everything. Section 2. The psychological blind spot. The inciting incident of 2007. So, January 2007. Steve Jobs walks out onto a stage and introduces the iPhone. And we all know this wasn't just a new handset, right? It was a totally new paradigm built entirely around a software platform. But Nokia's leadership, they looked at the specs of the iPhone and they just brushed it off. I mean, they were the absolute masters of hardware. The buttons, the plastic, the physical durability, they felt completely comfortable because in their minds, their own response was almost ready. They were totally blind to the fact that the entire battleground had just shifted away from physical hardware straight into software and apps. We actually have a very specific name for this kind of cognitive behavior. It's called overconfidence bias. Basically, it's the psychological tendency for leaders to vastly overestimate their own position. Years of wild success had essentially convinced Nokia's leadership that they just didn't need to change. So when they looked at this superior new technology, instead of feeling threatened or even, curious, their bias caused them to just feel comfortable. But you have to wonder, why couldn't anyone inside the company see the truth? Section 3. A culture of fear, paralyzed by anxiety and denial. Well, the real failure didn't actually happen out in the consumer market. It happened behind the closed doors of those glass boardrooms. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as emotional dynamics. This is the internal complexity and the psychological friction in decision-making that actively blocks a company's visibility to the customer. Basically, years of that bulky, unchallenged dominance we just talked about had quietly eroded their internal communication, and it replaced it with a deeply, deeply toxic management environment. Now, what's really interesting to see here is just how extreme it got. Inside Nokia, bad news was strictly banned. Board members were so deeply anxious about the shifting market that the word iPhone was practically forbidden in meetings, like a swear word. Middle managers were utterly terrified of disappointing the top brass, which meant the actual, unvarnished truth of what consumers wanted was completely blocked from ever reaching the top. Listen, if your employees are literally afraid to tell you the truth, the company is already dead, even if the balance sheet doesn't quite show it yet.
Section 4. The Fatal Leap. A desperate choice driven by psychology. Let's see how this builds, because with the truth blocked and reality totally ignored, panic eventually, inevitably, sets in. And notice how this happens along a remarkably short timeline. We had the iPhone launch in 2007. By 2011, the reality was impossible to ignore. The new CEO at the time, Stephen Alop, sends out this incredibly desperate internal memo, declaring that Nokia was standing on a burning platform and had to jump into freezing water just to survive. And incredibly, just 3 years later, in 2014, they'd be forced to sell off their phone business to Microsoft. But here's the kicker. That jump they made in 2011, it was entirely the wrong one. When they jumped off that burning platform, they made a fatal psychological mistake. They looked at the massive rising tide of Google's Android operating system, but they had this deep-seated psychological need to avoid the crowd. Because they were Nokia, they felt they absolutely still had to be different. So rather than just adopting Android, they partnered with Microsoft's Windows Phone. It was a decision entirely driven by ego and this desperate desire to remain unique rather than just looking at the cold, hard reality of the market. And by trying to avoid the crowd, Nokia completely missed the single most critical role of the new mobile era, ecosystems. An ecosystem is basically a connected community of external developers and users. In a highly connected world, standalone hardware simply does not win anymore. Communities of developers do. Survival as an isolated island was just mathematically impossible. Nokia's new Windows platform had virtually no users, which meant developers entirely refused to build apps for it. It was a ghost town. Section 5. The Psychology of Collapse. The Final Autopsy. Things became so insanely desperate that Nokia was actually paying developers out of their own pockets just to make apps for their phones. But it wasn't enough. In just 5 incredibly short years, Nokia plummeted from an €8 billion profit all the way down to a €1 billion loss. I mean, let the psychological weight of that sheer financial destruction sink in for a second. The absolute giant that defined an entire era had simply and rapidly exited it. So the crucial point is that the anatomy of this collapse leaves us with 3 incredibly powerful psychological lessons. Step 1. Adaptability always beats dominance. Competitive advantage has a strict expiration date. If you don't kill your own successful product to build the future, somebody else definitely will. Step 2. Ecosystems are everything. You absolutely cannot survive as an island. You need communities. And step 3, culture is your strategy. A culture of fear creates a psychological blind spot that makes collapse completely inevitable. Ultimately, Nokia's fall wasn't caused by a lack of money or a lack of brilliant engineering talent. It was caused by the psychological weight of their own history. Success, ironically, convinced them they didn't need to change. Which leaves us with a final, maybe slightly uncomfortable thought for all of us today. When you look at your own life, your career, your business, what is your Symbian? What is that outdated habit, process, or mindset that you are stubbornly holding on to simply because it worked yesterday? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.